Welcome to Unit 9, The Civil War and Reconstruction, Lesson 4, Women in the War. Think of a time when you stepped up and took on a role you'd never done before. You might have felt uncomfortable about assuming the role, but like women during the Civil War, you probably felt that you had to do it. Women on the battlefield. Just as they had in the American Revolution, women during the Civil War took on roles that brought them closer to the field of battle. Many women, in particular, became nurses. Before the war, society considered it inappropriate for women to care for injured and ill men. The Civil War quickly changed all of that. Soon, most nurses were women, and at least one woman, Mary Edwards Walker, became a doctor. In the North, Dorothea Dix and a philanthropist named Clara Barton led the nursing effort. A philanthropist is someone who actively promotes human welfare. Already known for her work on behalf of the mentally ill, Dix led volunteer nurses in a march on Washington in April 1861, demanding that women be allowed to help the Union forces. As a result, the Secretary of War gave Dix the responsibility of recruiting female nurses. Dix insisted that her volunteers be no younger than 30 years old. More than 2,000 women volunteered. For her part, Barton collected and delivered medical supplies, clothing, and food for Union soldiers throughout the war. She aided wounded Union soldiers and the Confederate prisoners they captured. In the South, a young woman named Sally Tompkins led the effort to provide nursing care through her private hospital in Richmond, which she supported with her own personal fortune. The hospital treated more than 1,300 soldiers during the 4 years it was open, and it returned more men to the battlefield than any other hospital. In addition, more than 600 nuns from 12 different Catholic religious communities also served as nurses during the war and attended to both Union and Confederate soldiers. Clara Barton. The founder of the American Red Cross, Clara Barton, was 29 years old when this photo was taken in 1850. A former teacher, Barton was working as a clerk at the U.S. Patent Office in Washington, D.C., when the Civil War began. Determined to support the war effort, she set up to help the soldiers, some of whom were once her students. Soon, Barton was following the Union Army to the battlefields, where she tended to the wounded and dying. Women at home. While some women helped on the battlefield, many more did their part at home. When war came, women all over the country took over the roles of their husbands, brothers, and sons in order to keep family farms and businesses running. On small farms, women and children took charge of raising animals and planting, tending, harvesting, and selling crops. On southern plantations, women directed the overseers and enslaved people. In the cities, women took jobs in factories and offices, replacing the men who had left to fight. Many women also volunteered to raise food and money, making clothing and provide medical supplies for the troops in their communities. Even for those women who stayed at home, the war sometimes came uncomfortably close. Civilians, or people not in the military, who lived near the battlefields had to deal with the sounds and dangers of battle. They could only watch as enemy combatants marched through their towns and raided their homes for supplies. To add to the stress, a family's only means of communicating with husbands and sons at war was through letters. Since troops were constantly on the move, delivering mail to them was difficult. If a soldier was killed or missing in action, the bad news arrived by letter. And since soldiers carried no official identification, many families were not informed at all. If a loved one's letter stopped coming, his family had assumed that he was not coming home.
Women served in a variety of capacities during the Civil War. They weren't merely spectators to the events swirling around them. Women left their homes. They went out to the field to serve as nurses and laundresses for both the Union and the Confederate Army. Women flocked to hospitals in their cities that received wounded soldiers. Some of those women were paid, others weren't. Nursing prior to the Civil War had been a profession that women really only had in the home. Most professional nurses were men. That changed after the Civil War when nursing became a public profession, and the women who had served as nurses during the war forged that path for later women. Claire Barton, of course, is the most famous Civil War nurse. She supplied her own wagon and drove out to the field of battle to tend to wounded soldiers. She did this without any permission of the War Department, but she was so successful, and the rate of soldiers returning to duty who had been under her care was so great that the War Department later authorized her to be on the field of battle wherever she could get to. Other women went to the camps because they didn't want to be separated from their loved ones. And so women were in the camps nursing their husbands. They were doing the laundry for the soldiers. And some women decided that they were going to pick up a gun and they were going to shoot back at the enemy. The Army, whether Union or Confederate, didn't want women in the ranks as soldiers. So the women who chose that path cut off their hair, put on men's clothing, and passed themselves off as men so that they could enlist in the Union and Confederate armies. We estimate that perhaps up to 1,000 women were serving incognito in the ranks. One of the most famous women soldiers was Sarah Edmonds. She was Canadian by birth and had made her way to the United States to escape an arranged marriage. She took on the persona of Franklin Thompson and served for 2.5 years in the 2nd Michigan Infantry. Her service was cut short only because she contracted malaria. She was afraid that if she went to the hospital, her secret would be discovered, and so rather than be found out as a woman in the ranks, she actually deserted the Union Army. Years after the war, she was, however, granted a soldier's pension. Now, not every woman who participated in the Civil War had to leave their town or their farm. Women took over businesses, they took over the running of their farms while their men were away at war. This was a huge step forward in the march for women's independence because their actions during the war in running the family business and running the family farm and getting the crops out of the field showed that women were capable and could do more than Victorian society had previously guessed.
Just a quick review before we end this video. Women took an active role in the Civil War, both on the battlefield and at home. They took on roles that brought them closer to the field of battle during the Civil War, just as they did during the American Revolution. Women all over the country took over the roles of their husbands, brothers, and sons in order to keep family farms and businesses running. That's all for today's video.